Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Today, I'm joined with Ron Puccinelli from the City of Fairfield and Robert DeRook from Indiana University. Today, we're talking about one of the biggest questions I always get as an IT auditor for local governments, and that is who should be setting up access and permissions within the financial application or the ERP, Enterprise Resource System, for user accounts. So who should be setting it up? Should it be finance or should it be IT? What I want to do with this is start with looking at, well, what is it that I as an auditor am looking for? What kind of control is it? So what is the risks of having finance do it or IT do it? Depending on who does it, what risks exist and what risks are we trying to mitigate? And so I think what I need to do is kind of like walk through what the process is so that you can understand what it is that we're looking for as an auditor, but then also what you should be looking for in your organization as far as who should be setting it up and how do you separate duties appropriately so that the risk of any type of, from the audit perspective, risk of material misstatement in your financials, but just risk of anything adversely happening. If you think about all the bad things that possibly could happen, you know, someone can go in there and change a vendor's name or change the vendor's address so that their payments get redirected to them. So whoever has this ability in a system like this, they could assign themselves permission or take over somebody else's account to make those changes. And typically, most of the fraud that we see, if we ever come across it, is where there is small incremental amounts of money taken over periods of time using various different methods. One of them is like changing someone's timesheet after it's been submitted and approved. If you have super user access, you have the ability to then make a change to it after it's been approved before the checks get printed. We had at least one example of that in the past. Another one is someone being able to capture a print job and then change the name that was going on a check. So it was a legitimate check, and the financial system, what it did was batch everything up, and basically all it was doing was putting all the information into a table in a database where somebody in IT could get into that table and then make any changes they wanted. At the end of the day, when they ran their batch process, it would then print all those items out. So it was like a little cache, and then it disappeared. So as far as they were concerned, and as far as everybody inside the financial system, when you looked at it, it was the vendor that got paid and not the malicious person. But the malicious person was able to go in there and change it. So understanding, one, what controls we need to have in place to make sure that those types of things don't happen. And that's kind of what we're looking at. So the question is, should IT or finance do it? In reality, it could be either, but then we need to have other controls in place. It's not enough just to allow finance to do it. And really, to be completely honest, let's look at some of these items, and we'll show you some of the bad ones that are the worst, I guess, and then we'll work our way up to the best solution that you can come up with. And then we'll talk about the weaknesses of each of those and why people use some of those. So one of the questions I like to start off with, and that's what we're talking about here today, and that is, what is the process that you currently use to provision new user accounts? And once they are provisioned, what's the process to set up permissions for them? As an IT auditor or as financial auditors, we're always looking to make sure that there's separation of duties within financial functions so that one person that cannot approve and then also initiate a transaction so that there's no accountability. We want to make sure that there's accountability, especially when money's involved, right? And then the next question is, who is the person that actually does it? So what's your process, and then who's the person that's actually doing it? Now, one of the things that you always have to remember is that typically the person that can set up the account can typically reset passwords and can also do permissions. In most financial systems, they don't separate that out very well. In other words, having the ability to create an account, but then you can't set permissions to it. Some financial systems have that capability, but most don't. Most of them, if you're the super user, you can do whatever you want on the system. And that's where our concern comes in. And if you're one of those people that has administrative or root privileges on the application, you're always going to be a suspect if anything happens. You may get cleared, and I get that, but if an investigator comes in after the fact and says, okay, who printed this check that was fraudulent, or who changed this vendor's name so that checks would be sent to their person's address or their cousin's address or whatever it is, the person who actually did the account that actually made the change is always going to be a suspect if there's logs and they can find it. If not, the person that has the ability to log in as that other individual, if that person shared their username or password with them, or the person that has the ability to set up a user account or change a password, because they can change a password, log in as that individual, do the dirty deed that they're going to do, and then cover their tracks and make it look like it was somebody else, or somebody else that does have permission to do it. So obviously there's a lot of controls here that we're also kind of talking about. I'm going to have to focus this in on just setting up the account and permissions, because there's a lot of ancillary controls that we can put in place that can kind of compensate for some of this. But then making sure that this process is solid will mean that we don't have to rely as much on those other processes and other controls in financial. And I'll talk about some of those as we go. But one of the things is, if those user accounts can typically make changes to accounts and permissions. So I could go to my account and make my account, if I'm a super user, then I should be able to do anything anyways. But even if I'm the administrator and technically my account doesn't have the ability to print checks, I could turn that process on. Or I might be able to turn it on for another account that shouldn't be able to do it. Maybe I can also change passwords with that account. So I could change somebody's password, log in as that person, give them permission to do whatever it is, print checks or whatever it is that the fraud is going to come from, execute it with that account, and then go back and reset that password. Person comes in the next morning and, hey, my password's not working. Okay, we'll reset it for you. And they reset it. Nobody's the wiser, potentially. So we'll talk about some of the other controls that will help us with that. Sometimes they can change the security parameters of the system. And that could leave the system vulnerable to other types of things, and not just necessarily malicious activities, but just accidents happening. So they change some of the permissions, or not necessarily permissions, but the parameters of security on the system, and that may leave that system susceptible to attack from ransomware or some other type of malicious software. So those types of things have to be monitored as well. Oftentimes, whoever this person is, also if they're a system admin or they're the administrator or root privileges on a financial application, oftentimes that also gives them the ability to delete audit logs. So if your audit logs exist on that system and only on that system, and they delete them, you don't have a trail to go back to during an investigation to determine who did what at when. And so now the person has some plausible deniability. They say, and it might be the person that actually did it. It might be somebody else who, stole that person's password and acted as that person. Can now say, well, I didn't do it. So now you're going to have to correlate some other type of event to show that the person was the person that was logged in at that time. Because there's audit logs also on workstations. So, but smart IT people know how to get around that. So, and we're not saying don't trust your IT folks. We're saying trust but verify. But looking at this and what are all the possible scenarios that can happen and what kind of controls we can put in place to watch out for that. Usually those administrators can create or modify vendors. They can typically do any function within the system and oftentimes hide their actions, whatever those actions may be. And that's the concern that we have, especially as an auditor, is we want to make sure, and it's not that we're trying to make things more difficult for you. You want to be able to be completely transparent and not be on a suspect list when an investigation happens, if an investigation happens. Hopefully, if you put these controls in place, you'll never have an investigation because you're never going to have any fraud. But it's really going to depend upon the controls you put in place and how mature that is. So let's take a look at one of the most, and I'm sorry that this is so small. I didn't realize it was so small. But one of the ways that provisioning typically happens is somebody in finance who is doing also financial functions, and this is the point there, is they're also the person that is on the financial application. They're the ones that set up the new user account. They're the ones that set up permissions, and they're also the ones that change permissions in the future if necessary. And so the only individual involved in the whole entire process is somebody that's in finance. However, that person typically has other financial functions, whether it is approving checks or printing the checks or signing checks or whatever it is. They have other functions in there. And this becomes an issue because now they basically have full access. And so there is no separation of duties with this person in any job function within finance. And so this becomes a big issue. And this person, unfortunately, now is a suspect if anything ever happens. They may not have done it. They're going to be a suspect. Now, they may get cleared, depending upon the evidence, but they also have unfortunately, the temptation that, hey, I can do anything I want. So one of the things in a fraud triangle, if you look at that, is the access to commit fraud. And honest people have been found, well, I don't know if you want to call them honest people at this point. Some people that are trustworthy or whatever at some point in time in the future fall upon financial hard times, and they have access to something, and so they take advantage of that access. We don't want to have the temptation for them. We want to make sure that they don't have it. They're not going to be on the suspect list. So out of all the ways that we can possibly provision user accounts, this is probably the worst. And unfortunately, this is probably one of the most common ways that I see. Now, there's some pros and cons to this. The biggest pro for this is it's easy to implement. You don't. The other pro to it is the IT department loves it because no one's ever going to be looking at them if anything goes wrong. And then they probably are overworked and underpaid anyways, and so they're happy to pass on any work that they possibly can to somebody else. So it is easy to implement. That's about all I can say about it. There is, like I said, no separation of duties between financial functions for the individual or individuals that have this ability, because they can always create a user account, they can always change permissions, and 9 times out of 10, they can also reset passwords. So this is a very difficult one to get by with, and it's one that I'd highly recommend you don't do. And what you're going to have to rely upon on this one is very heavily on your financial control environment. So when I say FCE, I'm talking about the financial control environment. That means check stock has to be secured, and that you're doing reconciliations on a regular basis. You can't wait 90 days to do reconciliations because now you're not going to catch anything in the normal course of business because it's too far out. And typically when people are that far behind on doing reconciliations, they're not necessarily looking at everything very closely. Does the number match? Yes, it's done. You know, we reconciled it. So you want to make sure that those other financial controls are in place to make sure, and they have to all be in place to make sure that this, and that with and depending upon how much you rely upon IT or your financial systems for controls, and access control is one of the ones that you rely the most on, you basically don't have for at least this individual or those individuals that can create accounts. And like I said, if you are the person that has that capabilities, you probably don't want that capability. There's a lot of things in IT that I say, I'm happy to say I don't want to have access to that, because then it just, not that it's a temptation, it's just I don't want to be on a suspect list. I always want to be, no one can ever question it. I'm always above board. So what's another way that can be done? So another way that we can do it is a request for a new user gets made, and sometimes there's a couple different ways that this happens. Someone new gets hired, and so for setting up the account. So HR puts in a request, and then IT will then go ahead and set up a user account. And the user account is just a blank user account. It's not got any permissions in it, typically in this scenario. And it can happen in a couple different ways. It can be set up, if your financial system is a single sign-on with something like Active Directory, once IT creates the user account in Active Directory, it automatically is provisioned in the ERP system or your financial application. That's a typical scenario I see. Another scenario I see is if it's not a single sign-on with Active Directory, it may be a Linux or Unix box, and when you create the user account in Linux or Unix, it then makes it available to the financial application for someone to use it. One other way that I know that's available is you create a local user account on the Windows server machine, and it makes that account available to the financial application for someone to log in. And then there's other accounts that are just the financial application has its own accounts, and it has nothing to do with any single sign-on or the server accounts that are underneath it. And I'll show a graphic a little bit later about, because I know that this can be a little bit confusing for finance folks. But when we talk about the IT control environment as opposed to the financial control environment, we have to look at the financial application, the database, the operating system that's underneath it, and all of those, and possibly things like Active Directory that handles user authentication and accounts. So however it happens, HR requests it, IT provisions the account, and then finance will then set up the user account. They'll set up the permissions. So IT sets up the account, finance sets up the permissions. So do you see any problem with that? Now this looks like, and I like to call it the pseudo two-man control. And I'm sure you've heard of the two-man control rule. You probably, if you haven't heard of it, you know of it because you've probably seen on TV where someone wants to launch a nuclear missile. It takes two keys from two different individuals, too far apart where one person couldn't do it. So it takes two people to initiate the launch codes and then turn the keys. So this looks like that, but unfortunately it's not, because it doesn't take two people to create a user account, and it doesn't take two people to do the permissions. That, if you have the two-man rule, it would have to require two people, like somebody would set up the provisioning of the account and the other person then approves the account and then the account gets turned on. And with permissions, somebody sets up the permissions and then they're not active until the other person has approved it. That would be the true two-man rule. This looks like it, but it's not it, because the person in finance can always change permissions, right? So the person in finance is still going to be on a suspect list because they can always change permissions of individuals. They may even still have the ability to change passwords. And I've actually seen in some situations like this, they still have the ability to create user accounts. So you have to make sure that if you have a financial application, if you are going to use this kind of control, that it does have those separations. On top of that, IT may also be able to override after creating an account and possibly being able to get into the financial application and then change permissions or add permissions to the account that they provisioned. So again, you're going to have to look at your particular financial application and see if you have the ability to set any of this, any other controls up with this. One of the biggest one would be audit logging, but in the short end of this, what do we have? So it does take two people to create and provision an account, hopefully, if the system is actually the way we've demonstrated it here, but it's not a true two-man rule. So there's, in theory, finance cannot create a new user account. That means they have to use the available ones, right? And if they don't have the ability to reset the password, then the only thing they can do is permissions. So they can elevate their own permissions and then de-escalate their permissions. But that may leave an audit trail in an event log or an audit log. So this one can be a useful control if IT truly cannot set up permissions on the accounts, because otherwise they're still going to be a suspect. And if finance truly cannot create a new user account, and that you have audit logs set up so that the finance person cannot cover their trails. You still have to do the other types of things. You still need to separate your check stock and secure it and do your regular reconciliations and all those other things, positive pay, whatever. Those other financial controls should probably still be in place. So if you're using that type of a model, there's going to be some problems in it. You may need to add some extra controls into it and make sure that this can actually happen. What I have found is that most of the time people have this as the process, but the system still allows finance individuals who are the administrators to still do anything in the system. and that becomes the problematic part. So you just have to kind of check that. So another way to do it is, and this is another great way to do it, and that is that a requesting organization, the requesting individual, whether it's HR or finance, will request either a new user account or permissions change. They will put that into some kind of ticket monitoring system, like Trackit or whatever help desk request, IT request system you have. Goes to IT. IT then sets up the user, sets up the permissions, and then it gets forwarded back to the individual that made the request, whether it's HR or finance, and then they verify that the information, the account is set up the way it's supposed to be set up and has the right permissions on it. So now this one looks like it's really good, right? So finance doesn't have any control, but they do the request and then they do the verification, right? So now we have a verification of the process, right? So the only issue that we really have in this situation is, yes, we have separation of duties for the finance function. So the finance person is now technically off the suspect list, right? And so every request that is made has to be made through IT, and IT has to do it. The problem is IT still has the super admin, administrator, or root access to that system. And this is where you're going to find where IT gets a little jittery about this because they don't want to necessarily be on the suspect list, right? And they're just trying to say, hey, you know, we're just setting up what you asked us to set up. We set it up, and then you're verifying it. The problem is IT, after hours, when nobody's there, they could go into the system and do anything they wanted with the system. They could change the passwords. They could log in as a regular user, set up a user, go ahead and then do whatever that user has the capability of doing, whether it's changing vendor names or, like I said earlier, changing the batch printing to change what the checks are actually being printed out from. I mean, some of those types of things can still happen. So we don't have a really great control now. We do have a little bit better of a control, but we still have this issue. And IT doesn't want to be a suspect in all of this. So how do we create some type of control that might be able to do it? Well, we have good separation of duties, especially for most of it. The only issue we really have is, what is IT doing, right? And can we verify that and somehow come up with a transparent process where nobody's going to be a suspect in it, and things are being checked on a regular basis. There is another good aspect of this is there was a request made, someone did the deed, and then there was a review process to verify that it was done correctly. So in the normal creation of accounts, that's a great control. You want to have something like that where there's a request, the department does the control, implements the account or changes the permission, and then someone verifies it and checks it. And if you actually have a ticketing system or something like that that can be tracked, that's even better. As an auditor, I love that because then I know, hey, I know things are being reviewed. They have good internal controls. That's a really good thing. Again, the bad part is IT is still suspect in this situation. They still could do it, and there's no review on what they did, right, in this particular one. So let's give you another one that will be slightly different. And now it's getting longer. You notice we started with just one thing. You know, finance just sets up user accounts and sets up the permissions. Well, now we got all kinds of people involved in the process. Well, let's look at this one and show how it's different in this one. The first thing is a request is made just like the last time, and the request is made by somebody like HR or the finance department. They say, I want this user, I want them to have this permission, or put them in this group, however you do it. Then IT goes in and provisions those accounts or sets up those permissions. Then we have the verification process like we had last time. Finance goes in and looks and makes sure that the accounts are set up correctly, the permissions are set up correctly, and then they approve it, right? Now, the account already exists and it's already in place. If there was something wrong with it, they would send it back to IT and say, no, you put them in the wrong group. The final step, this one kind of takes us to the next level, and that is that we have somebody that reviews audit logs on a regular basis. Now, in order to have this person has no financial function responsibilities, and they have no IT function responsibilities. So oftentimes in proper IT governance, we want to have separation of duties from IT administration and development and deployment and maintenance from IT security or cybersecurity, so that the security folks don't have access to live systems, but they have access to all the audit logs. And what you want to do in this type of situation would be have the audit logs taken off of the server at the time that, as soon as the event happens. We call it like remote journaling, or you have a security incident and event management system that kind of pulls the logs live to another system that the regular IT folks don't have access to. Again, there's where we have separation of duties, so that the IT security folks can then review and look for anomalies. Now, the problem that you'll have with this is most of the event viewing type of logging systems are not looking for the type of fraud that we're looking for here as IT auditors. What they're looking for is like threats, malware, people going to the wrong websites, that kind of stuff. They're not looking for, did somebody set up permissions in the middle of the night on the finance server? So the audit logs, you're going to have people look at the audit logs on a regular basis here. Now, this one is like, I don't want to say it's bulletproof, but it's like the best that you can get, right? So you have someone making a request, IT is provisioning, that's being reviewed, and somebody is reviewing all the actions ITs are performing on systems to verify that they're only doing what was requested of them. And this is where they correlate the logs with the ticketing system with the actual event logs. So they would put a trigger in the event logs, whoever the cybersecurity folks are, to say, any account creation, deletion, or permission change, I need to look at. And then it needs to be in the ticketing system somewhere. If an account was created and it's not in a ticketing system, that creates an event or an incident that needs to be then investigated to find out, well, why did somebody create an account and there's no one asked for an account to be created? Then they go find out, maybe there's a legitimate reason for it, but maybe it's like your financial application developer comes in and says, I need an account for a test purpose for this. Okay, great. But it should still end up, if they didn't put it through the ticketing system, it should trigger the security manager, whoever it is, to then come in and say, I need to look at this and see what's going on here. And then maybe look at the logs and say, okay, what did that account do? Because there was no request for that account to be made. Did it do anything? And then they can look at those types of things. So that would give you the best level of security. But that requires that the security folks know what they're looking for. So there's some other things that they should be looking for, and I can't go through all of the things that they need to look up for, but you're going to have audit logs at different levels on and we'll talk about those here next. So this one's a great one because we have great separation of duties here. We have the review for known provision changes, but we also have a way of catching unknown, unrequested changes, and that is with the security logging checking. Now, this is difficult to implement because you have to have separation of duties, and your IT and cybersecurity need to be separate. And what I find is that most local governments don't have the staff to do that. So this one is like a really good way to do it, but unfortunately it's really kind of hard to implement if you have a limited number of staff. Now, there's a lot of good reasons for local governments to have a cybersecurity department separate from the IT department, and there's other benefits for doing that, and there's other activities that those individuals or groups or departments can do that can help the city out. So another great way that you could possibly do it, because I know that some cities, some of the larger cities actually have internal audit function, and the internal auditor could possibly do some of this activity. But generally, they're going to be looking at certain controls on a periodic basis. So they may once every 6 months look at something like this, pull all the audit logs, pull all the requests, and then look for anomalies. They're not going to be doing it on a regular business basis. They may do it only once a year. Now, the idea is then that hopefully they would catch any fraudulent activity early on, and then it wouldn't go on for years or whatever it is, if you had that kind of a control in place. So again, difficult to implement, costs a little bit more because there's more staff involved, but is very easily doable with just the addition of one extra step, and that is somebody reviewing the logs. But the logs also have to be off the system, because if they're still on the system, IT folks could delete them, or if the finance person has access to delete the logs, then there's no way to go back to it. So you may ask, and this is a legitimate question, let's go all the way back to the first scenario. Finance sets up the user, they do all that stuff. Can I let finance do the user setup and permission setup and just have the audit log function done by IT? Now we have to look at that control. We have to say, okay, well, what could possibly happen? And is audit logging enough? What we have found 9 times out of 10 is they don't really have separation of duties with the audit logging, and that there's nobody actually reviewing the audit logs. The audit logs are being generated. Maybe they're even being spun off onto another server so that they cannot be deleted. But what we find is that most of the time they're not being reviewed on a regular basis. So that becomes an issue. How do we, because the only thing that that does is it doesn't prevent anything. It only, all it does, if you have the audit logs on and nobody reviews it, is that after the fact, if there's an investigation, we can go back and trace everything. So as an investigator, love it. That's a great idea. Have the audit logs on. You should have them on anyway, so that we can always go back and find out who did what when. The problem is if somebody's not reviewing it, it's not really your internal control. It's more of a, it's not a detective control. It's an after the fact, investigative control. So if you want it to be a detective control, in other words, you detect something as it happens, they need to be reviewed on a regular basis.
Good question. Some of the new SEIM systems include artificial intelligence that will trigger certain events. If we use that to do the review, and that would then catch any unauthorized account creation, would that suffice?
So Ron has a great question, just in case you didn't hear it, because he's a little bit far away from the mic. But, and that is, if we have artificial intelligence that's looking for those things and it catches it. So my big thing would be, like, we have to test it. We want to know that the artificial intelligence would catch something like that. So the idea would be to then create an account and then see if it actually generates a log. Artificial intelligence being kind of new, you have to you have to treat it like a machine,
right,
but you also have to kind of treat it as a human being, because it's making a decision. If you didn't use artificial intelligence and then just had a rule that says any new account being created, flag, and then alert, that would might be better. But the fact that the artificial intelligence could possibly, for whatever reason, say, oh, this one looks like it's normal activity, instead of actually doing it. So it needs to be tested.
Yep.
And tested regularly. But that's a good question, because a lot of the new stuff is artificial intelligence is becoming very hot right now, and everybody's throwing it into their systems, and they're putting it into threat management, threat detection. One of the things we have to ask ourselves is, how well is it catching stuff? And how well is their artificial intelligence versus others' artificial intelligence? So it's really hard, because I was looking at some spam filtering and email threat protection, different software vendors recently, and they all said, well, we have artificial intelligence. I'm like, okay, well, now how do I compare artificial intelligence from one to the other? Like, who's got the better one, right? It's only as good as the information it puts into it and the actual scenarios that it actually catches. So in that way, you almost have to treat it like a human being, that it could be flawed. So you just have to kind of test it and see if it works.
Proceed with caution.
Proceed with caution. But I'm not poo-pooing it. I'm saying maybe, try it out and then actually test it and see if it works. Because I think there's a lot of advantages to having, because people can't look at all the audit logs. And if someone created an account, and here's where artificial intelligence might be really good, is in that scenario where I said they created an account and it was created for the vendor to do something on, and then it was deleted later. So the artificial intelligence may say, hey, it was created, it didn't do any financial functions, and it was deleted, or it hasn't been used, or whatever it is. It can then say, okay, I don't think that that should be a level 1 alert. Maybe I'll make that a level 2 alert or something like that. So I think it could do a little bit of the investigation where somebody would have to actually If it was a person doing it, the person would look at it and say, okay, why was that created? And they'll spend like a half an hour trying to figure out when it was created and all that stuff, and they have to go interview people, find out what you do, and then find out and go back and then confirm that, yeah, the account hasn't been used for anything. Artificial intelligence may be able to do that faster.
Sure.
So, good thing. So, when I talk about cybersecurity, we always talk about the spectrum, and that is, you know, do you have non-existent controls? So the first one is there's no control, right? You think you have access controls, but there's one person that has unlimited access, the super user, the God account, whatever you want to call it. So for at least that user, there's no controls. So we put that all the way down at the level of 0, right? So on the maturity level of cybersecurity. We want to get it all the way up to like 5, where we have an automated process, where we have some type of quality assurance. The quality assurance aspect, which I kind of didn't talk about, was with the requests of user accounts, and then the creation of the user accounts, the review of the accounts, and the review of the audit logs, is that over time you're testing to see how well that process is working, and then change the process as necessary to make sure that it's getting you the results you want. And that is that if any account is created, everybody knows that it was created, and that we have an audit log for it, and it was reviewed. So to get to level 4s and 5s, that's what you kind of want to get it to. And you might be able to do that with some of the security incident event management softwares. We're always kind of looking for that. And again, the higher you are up on the control spectrum, the lower your risk is for access control, because this is really the only thing we're talking about right now is access control, because I haven't talked about any of the other aspects of this, because there's all kinds of other types of ways financial fraud can get done. I'm just talking about the access control to the system. And the reason why I started with this, because I'm going to do a series of different things that come up during audits where people ask questions about like controls for IT in IT. And the reason for this one is because this is a control that is relied upon all the time. You're setting up user accounts and limiting their access, and you're relying upon that as a control. So that in that aspect, IT is relying upon it. You may not be relying upon IT or the infrastructure of the financial application when you're sending checks, because you're using positive pay or something like that. So you're not relying upon the IT system for the control. But access control is one that you're always relying on. So started with it because I think it's kind of important. But I also talked about audit logging. So the question is like, okay, how complicated is this audit logging? Well, this is why I said it was complicated, because you're going to say it. How do you know that IT did what they were supposed to do? And I don't like picking on IT either. Let's say the service provider, because I have some cities where IT has no involvement whatsoever. It's the vendor that makes the application because maybe they have a cloud service, or they don't have enough IT staff, so then they have the ERP or financial application provider log in remotely and set up the user accounts. That's a whole other shooting match over there with the remote connectivity. We'll talk about that at a separate time because there's a lot to that too. But let's just focus in on this one aspect right now. So whether it's IT or the service provider, what have they done on the financial application? How do you know what they've done on it? Was IT able to get into your batch processing for checks and change some of the names before you actually did the printing and sending out, or did you change the address, or did anything like that happen? Other types of things can happen. Did IT make a wire transfer last night, with the financial system, if your financial system is connected to your bank? Now, you probably don't have to worry about that one because a lot of banks are now implementing 2-factor controls to make sure that wire transfers are not done. If it's electronically requested, then there's a follow-up phone call from the bank to verify. Sometimes there are dollar amount thresholds to that. If it's like, under $100, they don't care. They just process it. So you just have to kind of look at that control, make sure you have those other controls in place too. But there's other things that can be done. So a lot of people don't know this. IT is doing backups, right? Well, they have the ability, that means, to create a new copy of the financial application that's fully there without everything set up. And then they can do whatever they want to that system including run checks, and then make it disappear and never touch the live system because they set up a separate system, told it to print checks, it printed checks, and now, and this is why check stock has to be locked up, right, to prevent that from happening. But there's other types of things that they can do in that scenario as well. There was one instance a while ago where IT did a backup. They then ran a bunch of transactions, and then they recovered back to that backup. So they basically covered up everything they did. The only thing that the investigators were able to determine was a backup was run at 12:01, and at 12:30 a recovery was made. So what happened during the half an hour, we don't know, because everything was deleted out of that, because the backups ran, the malicious activity happened, and then a recovery was made. So during that window of time, we don't know what happened in between. Their audit logs are even gone. If you had remote journaling for the audit logs, then you'd see those types of things, but if you don't, it's going to be lost. So they can write directly to the... Say again?
I got a question for you.
Okay.
So in part of the security offerings that I went through, we talk about a process called a database activity monitor, a DAM, right? And
right.
It's part of its function is to, you can allocate what, like queries or what information can actually be sent to the database, can be verified, and is it run from a specific account, from a specific location, and those kind of things. Is that something that can be implemented here to help safeguard, to use a DAM as a control in this particular situation, even though, like in this case, they had backed up, made some changes, and ran a recovery against the database? Had they been using a DAM, for example, could they go back to those logs, because that's part of its function, is to actually see what queries were run and what account ran them?
Right, yeah. So great question. Yes, but again, we also want to have separation of duties there, because if that remote journaling or activity log is accessible to IT, does IT have the ability to make those disappear too? And
right.
So that's where that separation of duties on the IT side of things becomes very important, and that they don't have the ability to make those logs disappear. The benefit that we found in the past is that oftentimes the IT people aren't that smart, and then they leave the audit logs, and they don't realize that the system has audit logs. And so we now can see that the IT admin logged into the local console, did a backup, did a bunch of activities, and then so we know who the person is now. You know what I mean? So we don't know exactly what they did, but we know that something happened during that period of time, and they're the person that was logged into the console, because they were not smart enough to think, oh, I need to delete these audit logs too. So good question. Yes, you want to have multiple logs, but I'm going to take it even a step further here in a minute, because we have to think through the whole entire stack, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So they can make changes to account permissions. They can create fake accounts. They can change security parameters on the system, which could leave it vulnerable. They can delete audit logs or event logs. They can create or modify vendors. They can do just about any function, and they can do it without anyone knowing about it, typically. And so they can usually hide their actions, or they can introduce malware, too. Maybe they just, and the other type of thing is maybe they just want to pull information out of it. Maybe it's a disgruntled IT person. They just want to pull out all the employees' names and social security numbers and addresses. Maybe that's what they want to do. Different type of thing, because that leaves no trace in the financial records that ever happened. So is it a risk of material misstatement for the financial reporting? No, but it's a significant impact to the organization, because now it's been a breach. And now it opens up the organization to possible litigation from employees, because the city or organization didn't take proper steps to make sure that nobody could take that information. And this will be a case if your ERP system has also your payroll and HR information to it. A lot of them do, some don't. Some actually have separate ERP systems. But then you got to deal with that. So maybe finance doesn't care about the HR system, because HR system is a different system altogether. But the organization as a whole, or the city as a whole, does need to worry about that, because that is confidential information or PII that needs to be protected. Or they can introduce malware, which could cause all the different types of malware. You have to go back and watch some of our other episodes about that, about what you can do with malware. So to get that transparency with IT, you have to look at the whole stack, right? So I can go down each one of these stacks. You have your data. It's in the financial application, which is in a database, which is on an operating system, which might be in a virtual environment, which could be, is going to be on some type of server hardware that also communicates across a network. At every one of those levels, there's a potential of something happening where something can be injected or something can be pulled out of the system. So like we just talked about and Rob brought up, and that was the database. I can go to the raw database and make changes. Well, so how do we get we need to have audit logging on the database level. So yes, we need to have financial application audit logging, but then any other thing that happens to the database outside of the financial application, we need to have an audit log for that. They could do stuff to the operating system that can pull information or put malware on it, that can pull information out of the financial application or potentially do anything else harmful on it. So we want to have the audit logs for that as well. So it also helps with any investigation as to who might have been logged in when something happened. The virtual environment also needs to be, this is the thing that everybody forgets. We just throw everything up on a virtual machine. You know how easy it is to make a copy of a system with a virtual machine? It's right-click, copy, paste, right? You literally take a whole system and create a whole new copy of it, do whatever you want on it, print checks, do whatever you want, ask for wire transfers, delete it, and it almost never existed. And there is going to be no log whatsoever in your operating system, database, financial application. You're going to have to get it from VMware or Microsoft to make sure that the audit logs are being captured on what you're doing in the VM environment, right? Going lower to that on the hardware level, there's some hardware vulnerabilities. Not a whole lot of fraud is going to come from that side of things. But then on the network side, eavesdropping on communications. A lot of financial applications, especially if they're internal ones, may not have encryption because they think encryption is going to add performance hit between the workstation and the server. It's internal network. We don't need to encrypt everything. Well, the problem is some of these financial applications actually are sending the password in plain text. Or the information within it, which may contain PII, is being sent in plain text and can be easily sniffed across the network. So that moves more towards disclosure side of things, right? So there's a lot of different levels that we have to look at, and when we look at the audit logging, we need to look at all these different levels. One level I don't have displayed here, it's kind of talked about because it's kind of at the operating system level, and that's remote access. So remote access, how do you log into that, and then who is doing what on your system when they're remotely accessing? A lot of IT departments, they don't have specialized knowledge about the application in question. They have to turn to outside experts, which is typically the vendor, to do any of those types of functions that are beyond their capability. Because it's a very niche thing, and that's appropriate. It's completely appropriate for that. Because your IT staff cannot be trained as experts on everything. That gets very expensive. So you leave it to the esoteric experts outside, the vendor that made it, to fix all those problems, especially debugging problems. Especially financial applications, because unless you're using SAP or you know, one of the other big names, then you're probably using something that has a very small market share. And like in municipal markets, there's not a lot of municipalities. So there's going to be a very narrow market, and there's a lot of different financial applications out there in that market. So there's not like a universal one that everybody uses. So there's not going to be a lot of experts on it. So you're going to have to rely upon typically the vendor. What are they doing on the system? What did they do? Do they have access 24 hours a day? We find clients all the time, well, they can log in anytime. Well, how do you know that their controls are in place? What if someone hijacks their system, a hacker from Russia gets into their system, and now they find out that they have a remote connection to your system, they get into your system, they start doing wire transfers or something. Those are the types of things we want to look out for. So we can extract information out of it. They can bring the system down too. That's another thing. That happened to City of San Francisco, where They were going to fire the IT guy, so he locked out all the routers. So it basically took out their whole entire network. And if you look at that, they can deny access, they can corrupt the data, or they can disclose the data. So that's basically going back. We want to maintain the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of the system and the data. So audit logs on just the financial application are not enough. And as Rob very keenly found out, yeah, we need to at least look at the database. And I kind of took it a step further. We also need to look all the way down to the virtual machine. So all the way down, up and down the stack. So this is why financial controls are really important, because everything I've talked to up here, you think, well, I don't know if that's really an issue, because we do hide the check stock, and no one can do a wire transfer without the bank calling and getting approval from so-and-so. So yes, having things like positive pay, all of those things are still extremely important. You can't get rid of those controls. If you rely completely on IT, then all this becomes a really big mess. So you'll have to have your financial control environment. You need to make sure that those controls are in place. The processes within finance, like I said, making sure that you limit access to check stock, it's locked up and put away. You have positive pay. You're doing your reconciliations in a timely manner. You review the audit logs. All of those types of things become really important, especially if you're not at that higher maturity level that we were talking about in your processes. Then all of these become super important, and you sort of have to really pay attention to those. And you can look at the whole IT control environment, and you have to remember that on the workstation side, there's also issues, right? If you leave to go to lunch and you leave your workstation open, then someone can log in as you and then do any function that you have the capability of doing. And maybe you don't want anybody in the organization to be able to do that. So here's an issue. You have someone that approves transactions, someone that does the payment. So the person that approves it goes to lunch. The person that is the one that actually then initiates it goes over to that desk because it's still logged on, approves it, and then can go do the second part of it, right? So now you have no controls. This is why we're always talking about you need to have your systems log out when people are no longer at their systems, because it becomes very enticing for individuals if they fall on hard times or, want some more money or something along those lines. Also, just from and we were just talking about, looking at, I hate to say it because we're kind of like looking very myopically at the fact that it's probably somebody inside the organization committing fraud. But this whole entire stack that we have here, hackers, malware can attack at any of these levels as well, and then bring our systems down or pull information out of our systems. And so why cybersecurity is complex is because we have to look at all of this and we have to have controls at all those different levels. So it makes it a little bit more complicated. So what are some things you need to do? Make sure you have access controls for user accounts. Other types of controls you want to look at, backup. You want to look at the backup, who does the backups, and another separation of duties you often can have in IT, which is almost never done, is the person who does a backup is not the person who does a recovery. There's two separate functions. That's a good separation of duties if you can pull that one off. But you are relying upon the IT system for all kinds of other things that we didn't even get into here, and that is calculations. You're assuming that it's calculating everything correctly. It's handling errors properly. So if you type in something wrong, that it's going to handle those errors correctly, and that input is being validated, that it's you're putting in a zip code and it's accidentally allowing a zip code to go in there. Those types of things. So you are relying upon it as a control. You can say, well, we test the ins and outs, but you still are relying upon IT for some of the control environment for finance. So there's an overlap between the two. Common controls, access controls, business continuity, audit and accountability, which is talking about the audit logs and all that stuff. Identification and authentication, that's usually handled by IT. System development, who's developing it? Do they have a backdoor? Do they put backdoors into it? Those types of things. Communications, which is communicating between the workstation and the back-end databases or servers, and then just the system in general. So there's still a lot of crucial IT controls to help with that, and that's not even mentioning any compliance issues like PCI. So if you have credit card information, hold different shoot and match, different presentation in the future. We'll talk about the issues related to that. And with that, if you have any questions, go ahead and submit the questions. We do actually have some listener questions from a previous broadcast, which wasn't related to our previous broadcast, but somebody went to our website and said, hey, can you answer this question? And the question was, and Rob's going to help us with this, and that was hacking. How do Instagram accounts get hacked? And then what can you do to prevent that? So Rob?
All right. So there's a couple of key things to be aware of when you're talking about Instagram accounts. Like most of the accounts, they can exist both and be used both from a traditional PC environment where you log into a website or through an app that's on a smartphone. Now, the majority of some of the attack vectors that happen with the compromises of these accounts can range from a very easy phishing scheme. You received an email. The email says something along the lines that your account has been compromised. Please click this link and change your password. And that right there is the key problem in this particular scenario where your account has now been compromised, is that that link directs back to a hosted website that, for all intents and purposes, may look exactly like the Instagram website. However, it's being hosted by the attacker, right, by the threat actor. And what they've done now is they've harvested your username and password, and they use those to now compromise your account. They've logged in from somewhere else. They've changed your password to something else because they now have access to your account. They've changed a lot of the information associated to your account itself, as well as the email address that's now associated with your account. So trying to get your own account back is somewhat difficult because the way that Instagram actually happens or functions from a recovery standpoint is it looks at that particular information. So that's number one, is via a phishing scheme, right? Number two, and this one is dependent upon the end user and their smartphone and how tech savvy they have become. They may go through a process called rooting or jailbreaking, depending on the particular device. And basically what this does is it bypasses all of the internal security mechanisms that the manufacturers have already imposed. So something like if you've jailbroken or rooted your phone, you can now go and install a third-party application from a website that hasn't been vetted by the particular OS manufacturer. So in this case, you're bypassing the stores from Android and iPhone, as an example. Those two particular stores, they go through a vetting process of the application. They actually go through, they check the app, they make sure that it's from a trusted source, they make sure it's been signed, they make sure that the coding itself doesn't contain any malicious activities and stuff like that. And then once you install it from the store, right, that's a trusted site, right, because it's gone through that vetting process. However, like I said, you jailbreak or you root the phone, you've now bypassed those security mechanisms, and you can install an application from basically any website that's out there, whether you personally trust it or not. And a lot of times what ends up happening is with Instagram, there's a lot of filters that people like to put onto their particular pictures when they start posting these things, right? And a lot of times the attacker, the threat actor, will craft an application to do that, but they've embedded additional components or additional coding within the application to actually, again, harvest specific information from your account, like access tokens from when you actually get authenticated. Now, that again is a second attack vector that they will typically use, but that one is again more in line with you having to jailbreak and bypass the defaulted security of the device itself. And we're strictly talking about the smartphone, right? The application. Now, if you look at it from a website, for example, a lot of users tend to use the Remember Me option from websites that are presented to them when they have to authenticate. So when they go to a website, they type in their username, they type in their password, and right below that little box, there's that little check box that says, Remember Me. And they think, this is great. I'll check that check box and I'll hit the OK button, and I'll never have to type my password in again. True, it saves you that step, but the downside is you're now susceptible to a lot of what they call cross-site scripting attacks or request forgery attacks, where the website itself uses that cookie that's now stored on your system itself that actually contains your username and your hashed password, and that is presented to the website when you go to log in automatically because you've chosen that Remember Me option. Well, the attack vector now comes in that an attacker can compromise a website through cross-site scripting attacks, or, and this one is more common of an attack vector, where if you go to forum posts, for example, what the attacker will do is they'll have the coding actually in the footer of their signature line of a forum post. So you don't actually even have to click on a link. You just have to actually go to the forum post, and your system will actually process that coding automatically. And that redirects you back to a cross-site scripting attack. And then what will happen is they'll go back, they'll look at your access token, and they'll take that access token and they'll present it to the website. And they'll get authenticated because the website goes, yeah, that's my token, that's my cookie that I've issued to you, and in it contains your username and password, and now that account has been compromised. And that's just simply by you going to a legitimate site that happened to have that particular coding. And it happens all the time. There's very little that you can do other than there are some features within the browser themselves that you can stop. You can eliminate that type of behavior, but that then cuts down on the overall flexibility that the client-side browser can process. So you don't get a lot of, and I don't know if you've ever been to a website where they'll have like a screening or a roving movie in the background, if you've seen those, or if you scroll the web page up and down, like the content on the side is like a background image, stuff like that. Yeah. Those are from a robust website, but that processing all happens on the client side. So to limit or to put in some controls, you're going to basically turn a lot of those functionalities off, right? But you're trying to save yourself. Another mechanism that attackers typically will use to harvest information like that, because these three are probably the most prevalent and common that are out there. Again, it goes back to once an account has been compromised, things like multi-factor authentication, because there's been accounts in the latest breach, I think back, earlier this year, March or something like that. Instagram had a huge amount of accounts compromised, and even the ones that actually had two-factor authentication had been compromised. Now, we always hear about we should be implementing two-factor authentication. Yes, two-factor authentication is great, but again, it's one of those things that can be implemented incorrectly, and it defeats the purpose. And in this case, how they defeated this was they were using the phone and SMS as the two-factor authentication. So they would launch the application, the app would send them an SMS text, and they would just type the code in from the SMS text. Well, the phone itself had been compromised, again, by a jailbreak or rooted. The information that pertains to the unique identifier within the SIM chip of the phone was copied out. The threat actor then hosted their own with the same ID, so when a text message was sent out to validate, they just simply intercepted the text message and put that code in, so that bypassed the two-factor authentication.
Okay,
so
I think we're out of time. We're like 10 seconds left. So
the short...
go ahead.